Hello again, this is Yvonne Galusha, and this is the second video on range computation. You may recall I left you with the challenge. How would you handle calculating the average for however many scores that were listed? Right now we know there's 4, but just like we modified our average score macro to handle an unknown amount of students, we also want to be able to calculate average for an unknown amount of exams. So the first thing we have to consider is this little macro is written to do it once, and therefore it has to be repeated one time for each score. How are we going to do that? That means we need to send an argument in here designating the column that is used right here in the range. And that means we need to have a separate macro that works to call this. So what does that code look like? It looks like this. This is another macro. Calculate averages, meaning all of the test score averages, and we have to set up what is called a loop. We're going to get more into loops later, but I decided to go ahead and introduce you to a simple little loop, and we need to call it once for every column or every score. First, we need to get the number of scores, and this should be familiar to you. We already did something like that, but I'll just point out that we're using a range within a range notation, except now we're starting here at B1 and we're going to go to the right, and that designates the range B1 all the way to the right where there is no blank. We don't have a problem with some data item not being there because all the headers will be there. And then, instead of using the rows object within the range, we are using the columns object within the range, and we're getting the count method in order to get an integer value of the number of scores. Once we have that, the for loop construct is very simple. We just have another local variable, I, and we're saying it's like a counter variable. We're saying from I all the way going up to the number 4, repeatedly call our average score method, and I'm saying number 2 because I'm going to add a different one here. I'm going to modify it so that it takes an input parameter. Right now this average score doesn't, but average score 2 will, and we're basically sending that loop counter. So it's going to then, after one iteration, it increases I to 2. The second time it calls this macro, it's going to be value 2 on up through 4 in our case. So now let's look at the code for this average score 2. So the modified average score macro looks like this. I have added some comments. It's a good idea to comment your code and leave spacing for readability. When I'm grading, that will help you on your points if I can understand what you intended. So we've already talked about this, where we're getting the number of students using the rows object with the count method. This is the part that's new, right here. We are sending in an input parameter of the number of column, meaning the column represents score 1, score 2, etc. So it's going to come in the first time with 1. And you will see what I'm doing here is I am going to execute a VLOOKUP. Now that is a built-in Excel function. Last time we used an average function, but we did not execute it in the macro. Instead, we just set it as a value, a formula value in a cell in this worksheet, and then Excel itself executed it. So now notice the difference. Here, we're going to execute a VLOOKUP. let me just review what a VLOOKUP is, and then we'll come back and talk about this code. So what I've done on sheet 2 of the workbook is I've created a table. So in essence, the first test score is going to be in column B, 2C, 3D, etc. It's off 1 because we have the student names in column A. Now we'll go ahead and just review VLOOKUP insert function, or function. We're going to insert it, and here it is. And so first you have the lookup value. Now we're just going to put one in. What's going to go there eventually is going to be that input column value into the macro, but now we're just putting it in. Now the table needs to be this large table that I inserted, and it's pretty big. I don't think we'll ever have that many test scores, but I made it big. Now the column index that we want returned from the VLOOKUP is column 2, because that's the part we need to have to designate a column in our later code. So that's the second column in this table. And so we just say OK. And so what we can see there is we said look up the value 7, and it returned H out of column 2. So it worked. See? Look up 7, return H. We need to use this H to build the rest of the formula. So that is what we're wanting to execute, a VLOOKUP using this table out of sheet 2. So going back to our VBA code, first I have a new type of variable. It's called a range variable. We looked at that a little bit, but it's been a little while. So I'm setting my range, and it's going to be equal to sheet 2, range and those parameters, which is exactly what I highlighted a minute ago. That just happens to be where that table is located. Now, in order to execute a built-in Excel function, you have to first say application.worksheet function. Keep in mind this object-oriented paradigm. Excel itself is an object. Then within that object, it has worksheet functions. And VLOOKUP is one of them. See, it's separated by this dot operator, meaning member of. Now, this should look very similar. Column is taking that input, COL, and saying that's the one we want to look up, and we want the table to be my range, as defined right there, and then column 2. False just means it has to match precisely, not in between. Sometimes you'll use VLOOKUP, for example, if you're trying to say any, like grades, 95 and above is an A. So you could have a 97, and then this would be true. It doesn't have to be an exact match. This is a non-necessary argument. I just went ahead and put it in, but I could remove it because it's an optional one. Anyway, going on. Once we've got the correct column letter, now we need to concatenate that larger row value. You recall we were using B1000, so I'm just concatenating 1000. This is a string concatenation operator to the letter and replacing it so we have a complete notation string. And then down here, instead of putting that literal, we put this new calculated column representation with the row 1000. So let's go ahead and run this. If we ran this one, it wouldn't run because it's expecting an argument. But if we run this one, it calls this one, and it should populate all of them. And it worked. Now, let's talk about one more thing, and that is just demonstrating that what if we did have more than just 4 scores. So let's run calculate averages again. Notice I've added a score column, so we now have 5. And if this is working correctly, it's going to automatically be flexible and detect this additional one and calculate averages for all 5. And it worked. So just in review, what I've introduced this time is a few new concepts. Number 1, how to call a macro from another macro. All you do is put the macro name, and in this case we're sending an input argument, so you have to designate the name of that argument so that you can use it in the code, and the data type. And then second, we have how to do a simple little loop repetition. And then third, we've talked about how to execute a built-in Excel function inside of a macro. Hopefully you've found this to be helpful. Thank you.